Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth episode of Computing Education Things. I'm really excited today because, as you know, I'm a PhD student in computer science here at University of Houston and hopefully a future computer science professor. So I'm obviously interested in learning more about how my CS department could support me, but I really think that this is also relevant for anyone teaching in a CS role right now. I hope this episode gives you some ideas, and the person who knows a lot about this topic is Borja Sotomayor, Senior Instructional Professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Chicago and former Director of the Master's Program in Computer Science there. I think he's the perfect guest for this topic because he's currently on a sabbatical focusing on how computer science departments support their teaching activities. Borja, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Sure, I appreciate your time. So let's dive into a few topics here and feel free to take the conversation in a different direction. That's the beauty of this format. You never really know where it's going. But I think it helps to have a general notion of some factors that end up influencing teaching at the end of the day. So I was thinking one of them, I think, has to do with motivation, right? Because the teaching priority on the institution over other obligations, such as research, such as service, which may vary, right, depending on the time of the year. But as faculty, we can spend our time or too much time, for example, preparing classes, right? And because I mean it's normal. CS is changing fast. Its nature is the nature of CS is fast paced, continuously evolving. But it might be that teaching is not a priority for my institution, your institution there. Or maybe it's considered less important than the other two, than research and service. So do you think that sometimes this disparity, right, between the personal perception and the institutional perception of the priority of teaching can affect how much CS departments prioritize support for these teaching practices?
No, I think absolutely, and just I guess for a little bit of context for the listeners, as you mentioned, I'm sort of on sabbatical this year, and I'm conducting a research study on how computer science departments support their teaching activities, and specifically at R1 universities, specifically at research-oriented universities, because as you said, those are the kind of universities that tend to be very focused on research, and teaching sometimes takes kind of like a second place to research and even service. The motivation for this study, on the one hand, is a little bit self-serving. I'm as you mentioned, I was the director of the master's program in computer science for many years. Before that, I was the associate director. And I sort of got to a point where I sort of thought, I think it's the right time for me to do something different in my department. And I'm very lucky that our department at the University of Chicago, the Department of Computer Science at the University of Chicago, is very teaching friendly, and we have a chair that is very pro-teaching and very pro-teaching faculty. I'm stepping into this new role in the department as Director of Teaching and Learning, where I'm going to be supporting the teaching activities of the department. This is not it's not a common role, but it's not an unknown role. Like I've talked to a number of universities as part of this research study where some departments will have, an associate chair for education or a deputy chair or even just a director of education, or sometimes people like the director of undergraduate studies or the director of graduate studies end up also being kind of like the lead person on teaching support and pedagogy and stuff like that. But to sort of answer your question a little bit more directly, I think that in research-oriented universities, my sense after talking, I've talked with about 20 people from 20 universities at this point, is that interestingly, a lot of people do feel that overall they are in a supportive environment that supports their teaching, that they feel sort of supported, but that support is very informal. That support is very informal. It's very ad hoc because all of the formal structures, all of the sort of a lot of the effort in providing resources to the faculty is definitely more centered on on research. And it's not that people are not able to find mentors. They're not able to find people who will help them with teaching questions, etc. But it is a little bit more on the individual faculty member to do that. And that's obviously there's many different institutions, and they handle each of them handles this very differently, and we can get into that sort of like later on. But overall, that tends to be kind of like the general state of things.
Yeah. Very interesting. So let's focus on the teaching side, right? Because yeah, if you check my previous episodes, we also talk about research, but this one is especially focused on teaching. So let me make a comment here because I was working in the industry before, and sometimes I think that there are some things that CS departments cannot really teach CS professors, right? For example, I think this relates to the professors' innate curiosity. There is sometimes a gap, right, between real world problems and teaching. From my perspective, I'm trying to reduce that gap with my outsourcing efforts, with my newsletter, with this podcast also. But I don't think this training should come from the CS department, but rather from the professor who is connected to the industry, who understands, for example, if they are teaching intro to programming, where they need to spend more time. I think that often comes from that industry connection. How do you see this relationship between the real world and the teaching? And maybe if you got some insight from your interviews around this topic?
So it's not something that came up a lot in this study, but I definitely do have thoughts on this because it's something that has certainly come up whenever we've had to sort of think about what our curriculum should look like and what our classes should look like. And I think you do want to walk a fine line in that college is. I think we can't kid ourselves and sort of like not sort of accept and realize that ultimately many of our students are going to go into industry, and that it behooves us to make sure that they're prepared to make that jump to industry, that we can't just sort of focus only on like purely theoretical sort of like stuff. But I like to frame it more in terms of, the purpose of a computer science education college is really to teach you the foundations of the discipline. And foundations, people tend to equate foundations with theory, which I think is a false equivalency, because you can learn the foundations of a discipline. You can learn the foundations of computer science in both a very theoretical and a very applied, way. My favorite example is that when I was in college, I maybe took like 4 like operating systems like classes that were very blackboard bound, just explaining like all the algorithms and like here's how the processor schedules the processes, and here's how the the hard drive schedules the reads, and here's how the virtual memory works. And I kind of like understood it in principle, but I always felt like it never really fully stuck. And then when I came to the U.S. And I went to grad school at the University of Chicago, I took a class. An operating systems class that actually involved implementing an operating system in C. It was a simulated architecture, but it was still a sufficiently realistic architecture that you had to sort of bang your head against the desk to sort of like figure out a lot of like low level details and stuff like that. And the having to actually implement it myself, which is a very hands-on, very practical experience, taught me so much more about operating systems than just kind of like reading about it or having very theoretical explanations. And we like that tradition is sort of carried on over the years at U Chicago. Like our operating systems class like still involves implementing an operating system. In my networks class, we have students implement an RFC compliant IRC server. We have them implement the TCP protocol, and it's all very like hands-on, but it focuses on foundational knowledge. It focuses on really understanding the foundations of the discipline. And in my networks class specifically, I usually tell students, look, one of the goals of this class is not to, or rather, one of the goals of this class is to teach you how to work with network protocols. And I'm having you implement the IRC protocol not because it is some sort of like protocol that's in wide use like today, which it still has its uses, but it's not like a widely used protocol anymore like it was in the 90s. But because it's a good vehicle to kind of like experience what it's like to take a real sort of network specification and figure out how to translate it to code. Because you're going to, when you go into industry, I can guarantee you that you're going to be handed like some sort of protocol specification or some sort of data interchange format. And I'm not going to be able to teach you that in college because those are proprietary formats that I don't have access to. But I need to teach you how to understand how to pick up those, how to read those protocols, how to interpret them, how to implement them, and so on. So I think that it's okay to kind of be aware of what students are going to need to do in industry. But I don't think that industry should dictate like what we should be teaching in college. And I usually go to alums of my class and just often just talk with them and just sort of hear from them. Hey, what are you doing in industry? What are the tools that you're using? And I try to sneak as much of that sort of like in my classes. But again, at the end, the ultimate goal is to sort of make sure that students have a very solid foundation in computer science, both in theory and in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was reading this week articles about how technical interviews are changing, right? And how lead code maybe is not effective anymore because maybe you don't need to write code line by line, but at the same time, I think if you have access to AI, right? You still need to have some or you need to have this knowledge to really know right how to think throughout the problem. I'm just developing a new product that basically I want the students to decide if they want to use AI or not while they are solving the problem. But I'm going to analyze the prompts afterward to see if they need some more help, and I can design an intervention for them in order to cover that gap. So this you made me think about the methodologies, because I think it's an important topic when we talk about, teaching in the classroom. So each professor has their own style, right? Some focus on problem solving on the board, others use small groups or more class discussions, and others prefer more like theoretical lectures. In the CS community, do you think the lack of methods is a concern, or it's more about lack of time to innovate in their own approach? What's your take?
I mean, let me sort of like answer this from the perspective of what I've been hearing as part of the study that I'm conducting, which is that and you sort of alluded to this at the beginning of the conversation, that if you are someone who is teaching in a computer science department, particularly at an R1 university, where there's going to be a pretty heavy emphasis on research. And again, this varies. The degree to which the university might be focused on research might vary from one place to the other. Both tenure-line faculty members, faculty members who are going to be doing both like research and teaching track faculty members who are mostly going to be focused on teaching. One of the things that I sort of heard from several people was that they end up having to deal with so much of the small stuff, all the logistical stuff of like running the class and so on and so forth, that really eats into the time that they could be spending sort of making updates to the class, innovating in the class. There was one university that I spoke to, which is sort of like on the complete other end of the spectrum in terms of how much teaching support they provide to their faculty members, where they actually have like a small staff of instructional designers in the department. So not as part of a central center for teaching and learning or anything like that. Like in the department itself, they have a group of staff members that are instructional designers, instructional support staff, and they're there. And every semester, they're assigned to 3 or 4 classes, and they're there to sort of provide support on whatever the faculty member like needs. So these are not domain experts. These are not computer scientists, but they can handle setting up all the ed tech stuff. They can deal with interacting, emailing, dealing with student requests, and really only escalating to the faculty member the things that require faculty input. And it's up to the faculty member to decide how much they want to use them. Some faculty members use them a lot, and they have like knowledge in like instructional design and syllabus design, and they can provide feedback on that and so on. And when I talked to the faculty members of that institution, they said that they did really appreciate that it takes so much stuff off their plate that it really opens up time for them to focus on how can I rethink this class, or how can I make changes to the class. I will say that across the board, I I usually go to SIGSE, the Computer Science Education Conference, most years. I find it incredibly useful to sort of like hear the perspectives of other people, and I think that especially when I talk to teaching crack faculty, almost across the board, like everyone gets like some amount of professional development funds that they can apply towards going to conferences like that. I think when I asked them, do you use this to go to SIGSE, like the answers were a little bit more mixed, and I think that maybe that's the part that's missing a little bit, like being able to actually go and talk to other educators and hear what they're doing and so on.
Yeah, by the way, I've been at, I went to 60 technical symposium this year in St. Louis. I really recommend every single like PhD student or even undergraduate student to like submit a poster, because it's a really great experience. I think you can also do like hackathons, internal hackathons, or you can also participate in CS groups in your school. But then going to an actual conference is really useful. So yeah, you touched, I think, the schedule management topic, right? Basically, I think it's really important for well, here I'm talking about my perspective. I'm not a professor yet, but I think blocking time, right, intentionally for teaching preparation and even for research is very important, right? And that leads me to the onboarding, because I think you touched a little bit in your previous comment, right? I guess all professors need some sort of mentoring, right, and guidance on how to navigate everything, and time allocation from other professors. Not only for logistics, right, and or ed tech, but also a mentor who will advocate for you in the future. He's gonna advise you to. I think these mentoring dynamics can help a lot. It might even be a good question during the interview process, right? Because do you have these mentors? What kind of mentor I'm gonna have, etc. Because having a mentor, I think, really helps to navigate this new reality as a new faculty.
No, absolutely, and in this in the study that I'm conducting, we have an entire area of the study that's dedicated to understanding how do departments onboard new faculty, whether tenure line or teaching crack, into how are they supported before they start teaching for the department in their first year teaching for the department, and again, I think overall, the people that I spoke to, because I spoke to a lot of like junior faculty members who had been teaching for 5 or less years. So the memory of that first year was pretty fresh in their mind. And again, overall, people tend to feel like that they're in a supportive environment, but the degree to which they receive formal support can vary a lot. So I saw a number of different mechanisms where only a few schools had like formal mentorship programs, dedicated to teaching. Because if you're a tenure line faculty member, it is definitely more common for you to get some sort of mentor, where the understanding is that they're there to mentor you on everything, but like it's kind of like implied that it's mostly going to be about research, and maybe they'll be able to answer questions about teaching and stuff like that. But if you're a teaching track faculty member, or you're a tenure line faculty member that wants mentorship on teaching, there's much less formal mentorship arrangement there. Now, all that said, something that is very common that I saw at a lot of universities is that when you are when you're in the hiring process, and let's say that you got the job and you're sort of talking with the department about what you're going to be teaching your first year, a very common model was to have that new faculty member co-teach with someone their first semester or even their entire year. And even though they don't have a formal mentor in the department, that faculty member, that more senior faculty member that they're co-teaching with, sort of becomes their de facto mentor. And when I would ask junior faculty members, like in your first year, if you had like questions about how do I upload my grades, where do I find this thing, how do I set this up in my class, who do you go to, they would almost always say, I just go talk to my co-instructor, because they sort of like know all of this stuff. So co-teaching is a really great way to sort of like learn the ropes of how things are done at the institution before you have to sort of teach entirely on on your own. I've also seen arrangements where new faculty members get a reduced teaching load their first year, or especially, and for tenure line faculty members, there's more their first semester or quarter you're only teaching like a small seminar, so that kind of like where you just work with a few graduate students, so you have a little bit more flexibility to plan for teaching in during the rest of the year. And the last point I'll make about mentorship is I did talk with someone who made a very interesting point, which is that mentorship is great in principle, but mentorship also has to be very deliberate. Like it can't just be the department saying, we've assigned you a mentor, and then just kind of like hope that like magic will happen, because these two people are going to be meeting periodically. So there is also, I think, when a department runs a mentorship program, I think there has to be an element of let's think through exactly what the goals of the mentorship are and what we want to accomplish and how we're going to structure that mentorship relationship.
Yeah. So this leads me to another question I had for you, because I was listening to this professor from WASH EU called Jen Hemstra, and she published this book called Lab Work to Leadership. So all of these resources will be in the description. I think it gives good advice on leadership and mentorship and coaching, areas where academics sometimes or are not always trained for that, right? Such as giving good feedback, right? Creating, in my case, right, creating a collaborative lab, like building trust, building psychological safety, for example, right? I think this book explains this very well, but at the same time, I don't know if it's something that, for example, you can attend, business school, right? You can go through these programs that teach you in a few days or a few weeks how to be a better leader, etc. But I don't know if the CS departments, or do you think they can also teach that?
I think that there, I think that's where you start getting into pretty much every university I talk to has some sort of center for teaching and learning. I am a big fan of the one we have at the University of Chicago. I use them. used a lot of their services when I was a PhD student at the university. I think that they really helped me better understand what pedagogy is and how to design a class and what good teaching looks like and stuff like that. And I think that those kinds of partnerships with those centers are very important so that it doesn't. I think there's a lot of things where yes, it makes sense for the department to handle this themselves. And I'm not saying that it's not a bad idea to, like, for the department to maybe do a little training on. I forgot to make the point earlier that the person that I spoke to also said, if someone's going to be a mentor, they should be trained on what it means to be a mentor and how to be a good mentor and provide that kind of support. And some of that training can come from the CS department, but I think that that's where if you go to one of these centers, they're usually going, if they don't already have some sort of training for that, they're usually going to be more than happy to work with you in figuring out what that training is going to look like.
Yeah. So I forgot to mention something before where we were talking about, the different concerns professors might have. One of them is class size. I think, it's very related to what I'm living now, right? Because especially in on R1 universities, the class size sometimes is huge, right? Last semester in my software engineering class, I had 110 students, and this semester I have around 80 in software design class, and these are classes for seniors and juniors, but intro to programming like 200 or more, right? I don't think there are enough resources that teach you how to navigate such large classes. Yesterday, I was listening to this podcast, Design for Learning, from Notre Dame about these two-stage exams for large classes. The main idea is that two-stage exams increase like student teamwork, student collaboration by having students first complete the exam individually and then immediately retake it in randomly assigned groups. So I think it's a very interesting approach, but I want to hear from you. You have some other insights.
Like into how to manage large classes. This is when I was the director of the master's program. One of the things that we would work with a lot of adjuncts from industry, and we had and continue to have just a phenomenal adjunct faculty in that program of people in industry who just really enjoy teaching and sharing what they know, what they learned in industry, and sharing it with our students and so on. And I think the one thing that sometimes catches people by surprise who maybe don't have a formal academic background, and I guess you could say the same of maybe someone could be in a PhD program and had not actually taught their own class until they got their first faculty position and not having a good sense of what teaching a class involves, but that teaching a class is a lot more than just showing up for your lecture hours, talking for however much time and being done with it. That might be the case for small classes. That might be the case for very small classes. But when you're running a large class, you are the manager of a staff. You are the manager of a staff of TAs and graders. And I talked to a number of universities that have multiple tiers of head TA and regular TA, and they have TA training and they have TA communities and so on and so forth. And I think that running these large classes effectively does require departments to provide enough TA support and grader support, but it also involves the faculty member sort of understanding that they are also going to be a manager in that role, that they're going to have to work with these TAs. And when you have a very, very large class and a very, very large team of TAs, you really need to start thinking about, okay, maybe I'll have a few head TAs that then manage the graders, so I don't have to sort of individually manage every single person in the course staff. Some universities will have some sort of sometimes this is done by the instructional support staff that I mentioned earlier. Sometimes they have some sort of role that is usually like course assistant, course coordinator, who is someone who is there to kind of help manage all of that, all of that stuff. And I think that that is something that I was never explicitly taught how to do all that, and people are often not taught how to do that. In that, I think part of addressing that issue is, at the at the PhD level, at the stage when people are doing their PhD, like there has to be more training in pedagogy. Whether that should be required to complete the PhD or not, I think that's that is a battle I think that everyone would have to like fight in their departments. But I have spoken to departments where they will have a semester long or a quarter long CS pedagogy class that PhD students can take optionally, typically, that covers pedagogical aspects of how do you design a syllabus, how do you design an assignment, the principles of things like Bloom's taxonomy and stuff like that. But that also go into, hey, let's talk about what is actually involved in running a class, so that when you do it for the first time, it's not an entirely a complete surprise. And then when those there's fewer opportunities for PhD students to teach their own classes, but when they do have a chance to teach their own classes, it is very often the case that they are assigned either a faculty member to co-teach with, or at least a faculty member who is kind of like going to be the official mentor, like that first time that the PhD student is teaching, and they can sort of advise them on how to deal with all of the more management aspects of the class.
Yeah, interesting. So last topic I want to deep dive into is evaluation. Basically, how to approach it. One way, I guess, is basically from the perspective of metrics, right? How to measure evaluation. The other day I was listening to I listen a lot of podcasts, I know, but this one was with the professor, philosophy professor from Tulsa called Jennifer Frey, who does a lot of outreach to broader audiences related to her teaching. But those contributions, she said in this podcast, are not considered in her evaluation, right? Instead, other metrics, right, like number of publications, citations, dominate more, right? Maybe it's a matter of expanding what counts as valuable contributions to the R1 institutions. But I don't know. I want to know your take in what matters for the people you are interviewing. And yeah, I also have my own opinion here, but I think recognizing how students also benefit from the outreach. For example, this professor, right, probably was attracting or is attracting so many people to study at this university. We don't know, right? It's difficult to quantify, but yeah, what's your take here?
So this is something that we definitely talked about in the study. Whenever I interviewed both sort of junior and senior like faculty members to sort of better understand how teaching is assessed at their institution. Like as you sort of like said, it is very common, especially at R1 universities, that the teaching assessment component, particularly for tenure line faculty members, where again the research is going to be a big part of what's going to be considered for their reappointment, their promotion. There's generally a sense of as long as you're doing an okay job, like, and your research is good, like you're fine, etc. And that departments will sometimes do a very just cursory look at student evaluations, like the kind of like student evaluations or feedback that students fill out at the end of the quarter. The situation is a little bit different for teaching crack faculty members because their job is teaching. Like their career advancement depends on how well they do teaching, and that's where you do start seeing things like maybe when you're being considered for reappointment, when you're being considered for promotion, it's not just the student evaluations. It's also things like maybe you have a peer come and do an observation and sit in your class and sort of write a little report. getting, having the instructor write some sort of like teaching statement or collecting things like syllabuses and so on. Unrelated to this study, I am actually at the University of Chicago one of the co-organizers of our colloquium on the evaluation of teaching, which we run in like this is something that is being done by the Center for Teaching and Learning, and we sort of like offer this every year, sometimes every 2 years, sort of like 2-day workshop to sort of talk with sort of the people in departments who are going to be in a position to assess and evaluate their teaching track faculty and or even the tenure line faculty, to sort of go over like how do you evaluate teaching, and I just coincidentally happen to have the book in front of me, but one book that we've really enjoyed sort of like reading has been let's see if I can get the focus right. Transforming College Teaching Evaluations. I guess it's like the auto blur is. Oh, there we go.
No,
I
yeah.
just have to like cover my face with it. But one of the this book presents a very specific methodology called T-eval, and they have a website and they talk about the methodology in a lot of detail. But I think one of the things that I really liked about the method that they propose is that, look, there's different dimensions of excellence in teaching or teaching effectiveness, and there's different ways in which you can understand whether someone is effective in each of those dimensions. You can sort of like look at their syllabus, you can look at student feedback, you can do additional surveys, you can do observations, you can get letters from students that sort of talk about the instructor in more depth and stuff like that. So I think that talking with people for this study, I think that there was a bit of a sense of the evaluation of my teaching. Yes, they do tell me these are the things that we are going to collect and these are the things that we are going to look at, but that it does feel a little bit like a black box in terms of how are those materials going to be evaluated, and what kind of feedback am I going to get back from them. And at many institutions, it is often the case, especially for the tenure line faculty, where the only thing that is looked at is the student evaluations, which there's a lot of literature that talks about how these are very, very problematic and not they can be useful for some things, but not usually across the board.
Yeah. So it's very interesting what you said about having like a more objective approach. Like I was thinking like a rubric where you can evaluate each of these aspects from a professor. But yeah, in terms of service, right? I think sometimes you even don't know as a TA, right? I even don't know sometimes what my students are thinking about me. But I think a good way to approach this is like, okay, I receive this feedback from the survey, so let's now see or tell the professor, okay, maybe you need to improve in this aspect of your teaching, right? Let's see what the department can offer, right? Like having this kind of match between what the service say and what the departments can offer, and also, and you can also ask for help, right? So Borja, this was a great talk. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful. What is the best way to contact you?
I think if you just Google for my name, Borja Sotomayor, you'll find my University of Chicago page, and I have all of the various ways to sort of like contact me and links to my Blue Sky and my LinkedIn and my GitHub and everything. So everything is there. My University of Chicago page also has, if anyone is interested in this research study that I'm conducting, my academic page, the main page, does have a very prominent sort of box that sort of like says, click here for more details on this study, or if you want to even like sign up for the study and be interviewed for the study. So that I think my University of Chicago page is probably the best like starting point to either contact me or just like learn more about the stuff that I do.
Yeah, so I will share all of this in the description below. Goodbye, everyone, and see you in the next episode.